Randall, I can't hear you.
Let me start again. Good evening, everyone, and thanks for joining us. My name is Randall Miller, and I'm the Executive Director of San Francisco Bay Physicians for Social Responsibility. And I'm pleased to be the moderator for tonight's event, which is entitled Crisis in Yemen, Opportunities for Advocacy and Action with Jehan Hakim, Sarah Bakir, and Bob Gould. Before we start, I'd like to tell you a little bit more about San Francisco Bay Physicians for Social Responsibility. SF Bay PSR mobilizes physicians and other health professionals to defend humanity and the environment from some of the gravest threats to individual and communal thriving. Towards that end, we promote public policies to address the looming threats of the climate crisis and toxic environmental degradation. We champion the banning and eradication of all nuclear weapons. And we lend our expertise and credibility as an organization of health professionals to grassroots movements seeking to improve the health outcomes and overall quality of life for marginalized communities, including people of color. Tonight marks the start of our monthly series of online webinars addressing important topics and issues. Next month, we'll be hosting several important events. On September 10th, we're planning a California legislative roundup that will examine what progress, if any, is being made on environmental issues by the California legislature. On September 17th, from 9 to 10:15 in the morning, we'll be co-sponsoring a webinar with Climate Health Now entitled The Fire Next Time, The Devastating Effects of Climate Change, Racism, and Health Inequities. Finally, that same evening, September 17th, San Francisco Bay PSR will launch its first online discussion of our Racial Equity Reading Group. The book we'll be discussing on September 17th will be Harriet A. Washington's Medical Apartheid, The Dark History of Medical Experimentation on Black Americans from Colonial Times to the Present. This will be, as I said, the first in a series of book conversations to be held over the next 6 months. I hope you'll join us for all of those events and hope you enjoy tonight's event. To learn more about San Francisco Bay PSR or the events that we're sponsoring and the actions that we're taking, check out our new website at www.sfbaypsr.org. You can also sign up for our online newsletter, like us on Facebook, or follow us on Twitter. Okay, so all of that being said, let's move on to the panel now. In 2017, the United Nations declared the crisis in Yemen to be the world's largest humanitarian disaster. Yet, while this ongoing conflict has sometimes made world headlines, it has more often been relegated to the back of a long list of public concerns. Even though the size of the conflict, the number of people who have been killed or displaced, and the devastating health impacts merit far more urgent attention than it has received. Proposed and organized by our very own summer intern, Sarah Bakir, tonight's webinar is intended to provide an overview and urgent update about the armed conflict in Yemen and its devastating social, economic, and health consequences. According to the most recent reports available from Human Rights Watch, more than 100,000 men and women and children have been killed in the ongoing armed conflict taking place in Yemen. This total number includes more than 12,000 civilian fatalities and an additional 85,000 deaths from starvation and disease, while armed combatants on all sides refused access to international relief agencies to deliver much needed water, medicine, and food supplies. In 2018, with public sentiment turning against involvement in yet another costly war on foreign soil, the US Congress passed, and President Trump unfortunately vetoed, a resolution that would cut off continued military assistance to the Saudi-led bombing campaign in northern Yemen. Since that time, public attention in the US has turned to other pressing events, including the attempt to impeach the president, the myriad government shutdowns, and more recently, the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. But because we are global citizens, and because for those of us who are US citizens, our government is deeply implicated in the continuation of another proxy war in the Middle East, this panel is both urgent and timely. It's my pleasure now to introduce the panelists in the order that they'll be speaking. Jehan Hakim is the founder and chair of the Yemeni Alliance Committee. Jehan is a native San Franciscan with a degree in political science. She now lives in the East Bay with her 4 children. Her family is originally from Yemen, and as I said, she's the founder and chair of the Yemeni Alliance Committee based right here in the Bay Area, a social advocacy group working to resist anti-Yemeni policies. Jehan is also on the board of Just Foreign Policy. Sarah Bakir is a first year or entering first year MPH student at UC Berkeley, studying epidemiology and biostatistics, as I said, at the University of California, Berkeley School of Public Health. She's a summer intern at the SF Bay PSR and has done a wonderful job in moving a number of very important projects forward, including this one. Sarah is also an advisor to the all student chapters of California Physicians Alliance across California. Within public health, Sarah is most interested in humanitarian health and infectious disease, which is no surprise given the panel that she's helped organize tonight. The last panelist, the final panelist, really needs no introduction. It's our own Dr. Bob Gould, who is the board president of SF Bay PSR. Bob is an associate adjunct professor in the Department of Obstetrics, Gynecology, and Reproductive Sciences at the University of California, San Francisco School of Medicine, where he is a collaborator with the Program on Reproductive Health and the Environment. He has been president of the San Francisco Bay PSR since 1989, which is surely a record, and has been on the board of the National PSR since 1993, also a record probably, serving as its president in 2003, and then again as the president of National PSR in 2014. Bob is the chairperson of the American Public Health Association's Peace Caucus, and also a leading member of the Environmental Committee of the Santa Clara County chapter of the California Medical Association. So we've got a pretty impressive panel for you. And we've asked each of the panelists to speak for roughly 15 to 20 minutes. And then we'll open the floor for questions. And I'll give you more instructions about how we'll manage the questions in just a few minutes. But right now, we want to ask Jehan Hakim, the founder and chair of the Yemeni Alliance Committee, if she would deliver her presentation to us. Thank you, Jehan, for being with us.
Hi, everyone. You guys hear me okay? Okay, great. Thank you so much to Physicians for Social Responsibility, for all the organizers that are doing the back end work, Dr. Gould, Sarah Bakir for doing this amazing research that I think is going to be so crucial to really measuring what the impact on the people of Yemen is going to look like in the foreseeable future. A special thank you to those tuning in. I wanted to quickly give you an overview of who we are. The Yemeni Alliance Committee, we are a social advocacy group of volunteers. We're Yemeni American organizers that formed in the Bay Area. We've also started chapters in Michigan and New York. We are nonpartisan, meaning we don't endorse any side. Instead, we insist on the sovereignty of Yemen. And we came together to push back against our government's role in the oppressive policies on our family's homeland, such as the Muslim ban, which continues to separate families, and the war in Yemen, which continues to starve and kill hundreds of thousands of Yemenis. We do this by raising awareness. We organize protests. We draft and sign on to advocacy letters. We create toolkits and different talking points to kind of help folks get engaged. And we also write for various outlets on the plight of Yemen. I thought it was worth mentioning that, like Randall said earlier, I was born and raised in San Francisco, and the critique that I have for the America that I love, that is home to me and my family. I'm also a mom of 4. It's where all of this passion comes from, to be quite frankly. As I told Bob the other day, when you love someone or something so much, you want them or it to be better. So today I will attempt to break down a very, very complex situation as a Yemeni American who is an organizer, works in the field of foreign policy, and also have friends, family, colleagues that are still in Yemen. So here you have a map of Yemen. It's circled in red, and then you can also see, some of our neighbors. Historically, the southern of the Arabian Peninsula was known as Yemen as-Sa'id, which means the happy Yemen. It was called this because of its geography and natural climate, the rainfalls, the valleys, and the rivers. It was a fertile land. Ancient Romans called Yemen Arabia Felix, meaning happy Arabia. You can see that Yemen is kind of tiny in comparison to the larger continent of Africa, which is to the west of us, and Asia is to the right or the further east, as some have said in the past. Yemen is in the Middle East, but still considered a part of Asia. I think geography and history are kind of important, so bear with me while I give you a little bit of a taste of the past. Here you'll see 2 different maps. The more colorful one under the title shows you a breakdown of larger cities. It also shows you the difference between the north and the south. Sana'a has always been the capital of Yemen until recently. The internationally recognized Yemeni government has declared Aden, which is in the south, as the capital. My family is from that little area in yellow called Ib. It's part of northern Yemen. I used to go to Yemen every summer as a child. And then the map on the right gives us an idea of who our neighbors are. Yemen borders Saudi Arabia and Oman. Also want you to note how far Iran is, and this will be important later. Yemen has a population of 28 to 30 million, similar to that of Venezuela. 80% of Yemenis live in northern Yemen, while the rest live in, the 20% live in the southern part of Yemen. Although we can see that the southern part looks much larger, but it is mostly uninhabited. The spoken language in Yemen is Arabic, and it is a Muslim majority country. So the next couple of slides, before I get into some of the heartache, I wanted to show you a little bit of Yemen's ancient beauty. Yemen is home to mocha coffee. If you guys have ever been to Starbucks and ordered a mocha, there's a town in Yemen called Mocha. It's also home to the rarest dragon blood trees and home to the Queen of Sheba or Seba. So I'm not going to delve too far back, but I welcome folks to read about Yemen's history before we came known for poverty and war. So here you'll see the old walled city of Shaybam in southern Yemen. These buildings are 6 to 8 stories high and made of mud. They're skyscrapers, and they were called the Manhattan of the desert. These buildings have lasted over 500 years in the desert. I have not been fortunate enough to visit them. And I don't know if I will due to the crisis. Here you have Sana'a al-Qadima, which is in English, the old Sana'a or the old city of Sana'a, which is a UNESCO heritage site. These buildings have distinctive architectural character, most notably expressed in its multi-story buildings decorated with geometric patterns. They are over 2,500 years old. And due to the war and exacerbated by the floods, the old city of Sana'a is crumbling as we speak. These lovely trees are in the island of Socotra, which is in southern Yemen. This island, another place I've never been to, is filled with alien plant life. About 30% of the vegetation cannot be found anywhere else in the world, such as these rarest dragon blood trees, in addition to many other natural and human-made wonders, some of which have been destroyed due to the war. And this island in particular has been occupied by the United Arab Emirates for the last couple of years. So, getting into the nitty-gritty. I think a lot of people, when they either Google Yemen, not only do you see pictures of mass destruction and hungry children and dying people, you also hear about that at first glance, this conflict seems to be nothing more than a struggle for power between two warring parties in one country. Or sometimes we hear that it's a sectarian war. I want to make clear that what is happening in Yemen is not a sectarian war. It isn't a Sunni versus Shia conflict. Over 60% of Yemen's population is Sunni, and over 30% are Zaydi. So Zaydis are not Shia. I'm not pitting, just clarifying. They're closest to Sunni Islam, and they are known as, to some, as the Fivers, and very different from the Twelvers of Iran, who are clearly Shia. And then the Zaydi sect is a local sect of Islam that is very, like I said, local to Yemen. And Sunnis and Zaydis have lived together for centuries in Yemen. They intermarry, they share the same mosque. And I just put a table there below for comparison. It shows that out of the 1.6 billion Muslims in the world, 85% are Shia. I'm sorry, 85% are Sunni and 15% are Shia. And historically, these two groups have lived and coexisted for centuries until geopolitics got involved. So before we can get into what's happening right now, I want to briefly provide a little bit more context around Yemen's political history before the war. Yemen was ruled by Zaydi imams for over 1,000 years before the Ottoman Empire. You can see that in 1803, Saudi Arabia attacked Yemen and took control of Tehama. So you can, intervention is not new to us, foreign intervention. And later on, the Ottomans conquered northern Yemen. The south was taken by the Brits. For them, it was strategically and economically important to their empire. And they ruled until about 1960. So after the Ottoman Empire fell, the Zaydis, or the Imamate, ruled from 1918 to 1962. You can see right there in between, there was another invasion in 1934 where Saudi Arabia again invades Yemen with the help of the UK. Wanting to take over Yemeni territories that border Saudi Arabia. And what happened then is they took Jehan, Asr, and Najran, which today are a part of Saudi Arabia, but were once part of Yemen. That quarrel kind of was on pause a little bit due to a peace agreement that guaranteed 20 years of peace. A little later, as the Imamate, Imam Ahmed died, and it was kind of like, Yemen was kind of like a monarchy. He was supposed to be succeeded by his son, but then army officers seized power and set up the Yemen Arab Republic, or YAR. And that sparked a civil war between those who were loyal to Saudi Arabia and then those who were backed by Egypt. Again, Britain got involved at that time, and some 200,000 people were killed in that war. So there hasn't been a 10-year period in Yemen's history since the 1960s that has not witnessed either violent conflicts, coups, or civil insurrections. Beginning in 1962, there was an uprising that I mentioned earlier. The problem is that Yemenis have yet to find a means to build institutions of state and society that can address successfully the grievances of political and economic marginalization. And alienating populations and marginalized communities became some sort of a norm. Of course, add into that the meddling of foreign powers. So at this point, North and Southern Yemen were still split. And then in 1990, Ali Abdullah Saleh became president, and then he unified the North and the South. And that only created an extra layer of complexity to the country's existing problems, because you had the North, which was ruled by tribalism, and then you have the South, which was the only Marxist state in the Arab world. So now they're kind of intertwined, which of course will bring about some discontent. And it did. So that unity lasted up until 1994. The South wanted out of this forced unity. So in 1994, there was a civil war that broke out. It was 3 months long, and Ali Abdullah Saleh won. And as we all know, whenever there are coups, wars, or occupations, there will be segments of any given population that will be marginalized due to the lack of representation and corruption. It's inevitable. So this dynamic, it creates factions. So before I go down the timeline of political events, let me quickly go to the next slide and address the Houthis. Who are the Houthis? So the rise of political Islam, like the Muslim Brotherhood, which is known as the Islah Party in Yemen, and the Zaydi Houthis have raised tensions within Yemen. So too has the spread of Sunni ideology, Salafism in particular. So this was a key contributing factor in the emergence of the Houthi movement. And then the Houthis, their title or their party name is called Ansar Allah. In Arabic, in English, Ansar Allah means the helpers of Allah. And they have been coined as Houthis after their commander, whose name is Hussein Badr al-Din al-Houthi. So that movement began in the early 1990s to promote a Zaydi revival. As we remember, the Zaydi imamate fell decades ago. They wanted a return of the imamate period, and had a really strong aggression towards Saudi influence. And since then, it has morphed into an armed political group. The Houthis are predominantly Zaydis. This party is also composed of other Yemenis who may not necessarily be Zaydi. And not all Zaydis are Houthis. So Zaydis, like I said, are a sect of Islam, and the Houthis are an actual party, political party, and now becoming a warring party, who are very much Yemeni. Historically, 40% of Yemen's population come from Zaydi family lines. Since becoming a militarized group, the Houthis, or Ansar Allah, have been accused of war crimes, and there is a lot to blame on their side. Let me go back to the previous slide. So we went over how the North and South were forced to unite, which resulted in a civil war. Saleh won, and Yemen was again reunited. This leads us into the early 2000s. And we know the events that followed the tragic attacks on September 11th of the towers also subsequently impacted the Middle East. Since then, America has militarized every aspect of its foreign policy. Long-standing tensions between values and interests, really abruptly tilted in favor of an extreme counter-terror approach. Congressional authorization for the use of military force, or the AUMF, has provided the legal authority of the wars that began with the invasion of Afghanistan in the fall of 2001. For Yemen specifically, the war on terror has meant routine drone strikes, which continue until today, the detaining and torture of Yemeni nationals at Guantanamo Bay, the NSEERS program, which is, sort of like the old Muslim registry. NSEERS stands for the National Security Entry Exit Registration System. And this required Yemeni nationals who were coming in and out of the United States, to be, screened, monitored, and just kind of followed all around. And what Obama did graciously right before he left office was rescind NSEERS in 2016. In addition to systemic Islamophobia for Yemeni Americans and Muslim Americans overall here at home, with all the racial profiling and a lot of the discriminatory practices that we probably don't have time to go into today. So I'm sorry, forgive me for all the bouncing back and forth. So fast forward, we're in the 2000s, right? So 2004 to 2010, there were 6 civil wars that took place between the Saleh government. Mind you, keep in mind that Ali Abdullah Saleh was Zaidi himself. So those wars, civil wars took place between the Saleh government and the Houthis. Then the Houthis launched an insurgency against President Saleh, citing corruption, citing economic grievances, and for backing Saudi Arabia and the US at the expense of the Yemeni people. So they became known as a group or a rebel group, or you'll find people saying militants. They became contenders in the political sphere of Yemeni politics. Fast forward comes the Arab Spring. So what does the Arab Spring look like for Yemen? When the Arab Spring took the MENA by storm in 2011, the democratic wave entered Yemen fairly early, right after Tunisia and Egypt. So in January of 2011, Yemenis poured into the streets in a country that is highly armed, second to the US per capita. The protests were peaceful. There were Houthis, women, marginalized communities, all calling for change, independence, and wanting to oust the 33-year running dictator, Ali Abdullah Saleh. Even though Yemen is a democracy, Ali Abdullah Saleh continued to rule for over 3 decades. So this revolt, like I said, was peaceful until about May of 2011, when the Islah Party joined the streets. Like I said, who are the, Yemen's version of the Muslim Brotherhood. They have been longtime allies with Saleh and were part of the regime or the system that Yemenis wanted to change. And they realized there's an opportunity to fill the power vacuum. So the Islah Party joined to also oust Saleh, wanting to take over Yemen. And this is when protests turned violent. And clashes started between Saleh forces and al-Islah. Saleh refused to step down, so the Islah bombed his palace in June of 2011 and attempted to assassinate Ali Abdullah Saleh. And he survived. So civil unrest in Yemen continued for the next 3 years. Saleh stepped away and put Abdul Mansur Hadi, who you see here, his longtime VP, in his place. So Hadi made promises to bring all parties to the table, but the political transition led to mass unrest. So in September of 2014, restless, the Houthis staged a coup and marched down to the capital from Sa'da. So Sa'da are where primarily the Houthis tend to live and organize. Sa'da is a really high mountainous place in the very northern part of Sana'a. And they took over Sana'a. And they put Hadi on house arrest. And then Hadi resigned, and then he fled to Aden, which is in the south, his hometown. He later retracted that resignation. The civil war breaks out between the Houthis and the Yemeni army loyal to the Hadi government. And there were internal uprisings elsewhere, also in the south, also wanting independence and wanting freedom from the north again. There were talks about splitting Yemen into 6 states, Then an agreement between Yemen's rival factions in February of 2015, brokered by the UN, set up a transitional council that keeps the parliament in place and gives a voice to some other groups. Unfortunately, discontent and clashes continued. So in March of 2015, President Abdul Mansur Hadi fled to Saudi Arabia, and he appealed for international intervention. Saudi Arabia and a hastily assembled international coalition, referred to as the Saudi-led coalition, launched military offensive aimed at restoring Hadi's rule. And they call it evicting Houthi fighters from the capital and other major cities. And what the coalition led by Saudi Arabia used as their assessment for intervention is that there had allegedly been up to a few thousand Iranian and Iraqi trainers in Yemen helping the Houthis. I want to also note that during this time, Iran agreed to a long-term deal on its nuclear program with a group of world powers, with the hopes of relief from economic sanctions. So on the eve of March 26, 2015, 5 years ago, Saudi Arabia, under the leadership of Malik bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, who had only been in power for 2 months, launched airstrikes on Yemen, abruptly escalating this localized civil war into a regional inferno. So who is the coalition? We hear about the coalition, and I think, I think depending on what year you're looking at, this coalition can change. So currently, the coalition is composed of Saudi Arabia, is led by Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. And their coalescing partners are Kuwait, Bahrain, Sudan, Egypt, Morocco, Senegal. Qatar stepped out of the coalition or was expelled in 2017, and Jordan's role is undefined. These countries have been, really leading the aerial bombardment on Yemen for the past 5 years. And who's helping? So the coalition is backed and supported by the US, the UK, and other partners who've been providing the coalition with. Specifically, I'll mention the US since we're all Americans in here. What the US does is it trains Saudi forces. We also maintain, repair, and upgrade the coalition's vehicles and aircrafts. We provide intelligence support and targeting assistance. There also have been Green Berets, US Special Forces at the Saudi-Yemeni border. And we also provide arms. So the bombs that are striking Yemeni homes, school buses, and children are made in the USA. The intervention began as a mission that was supposed to be temporary, to last for a few months. It was called Operation Decisive Storm. It has not been a civil war for years. What is civil about war anyways, right? A lot of people hear about the war, the clashes, and the violence, yet I believe the most brutal part of this war that receives very little attention is the blockade. The coalition imposed a naval, land, and air blockade on Yemen since the coalition began in March of 2015. This has severely restricted the flow of food, fuel, and medicine to civilians. It continues to prevent much aid and nearly all commercial imports from reaching Houthi-controlled ports. And this has had a disproportionate impact on civilians' access to essential goods. The coalition's military strategy in Yemen has been increasingly built around preventing desperately needed aid and essential goods from reaching civilians. And that has risked millions of lives of Yemenis. And a lot of independent agencies have called this action economic warfare. And I want to remind us that this is backed and reinforced by the US Navy. Yemen heavily relies on imported food, medicine, and fuel for up to 80 to 90% of Yemen's population. Sana'a, and the old capital's airport, has been closed, and the only airport available for Yemenis to travel in and out of Yemen is in Sa'yun, which is in the south. It's extremely far away. It's a 23-hour ride from Sana'a. It's quite a long journey, and hardly anyone has the financial means or the health to travel there, not to mention it being extremely unsafe. When we hear about Yemen being the world's worst humanitarian crisis that we've seen in decades, this blockade has contributed to why that is the case. So in addition to military support, the United States, under the Obama administration, provided the coalition with much needed weapons from US-made bomb manufacturers, such as Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, General Dynamics, and Boeing. There have been over 120 arms contracts since 2015, totaling to $120 million a month. Just an FYI, other weapon suppliers are the UK, France, Canada, China, Brazil, Spain, Italy, Germany, and the Netherlands recently banned arms sales. So did the UK. However, recently they resumed arms sales, unfortunately. There were $110 billion worth of arms sales to the coalition under Obama. And now Trump has made contracts with Saudi Arabia, allegedly worth $350 billion. When Trump was asked about these arm deals the beginning of his presidency, he said, "I don't like the concept of stopping an investment of $110 billion into the United States. You know what they're going to do? They're going to take that money and spend it in Russia or China or someplace else." End of quote. War profiteering at its finest, right? So we can't talk about Yemen, the Houthis, the war, without talking about the role of Iran, because I think it has been the most conflated talking piece that has justified, this aggression, by this administration, by Nikki Haley, by Saudi Arabia. We hear Iran-backed Houthis. We hear Iran-aligned Houthis. If you notice, almost any article that is not independent, especially those that are not independent, will only refer to Houthis as being Iran-backed or Iran-aligned. And I think that gives us something to think about. Why is that the case? Because would they be less of a threat if they weren't backed by Iran? I mean, would it be less okay to bomb them if they were not backed by Iran? Something to think about. So the Iran relationship with the Houthis is old. They've had ties since the late 70s. What we do know is that since the war, the Houthis receive political support, in addition to media support from Iran, news coverage through their outlet called Al-Masira, which is broadcasted from Beirut with Hezbollah assistance, because the Lebanese are Arab and they speak Arabic, while Iranians speak Farsi, and the Houthis are Yemeni and they speak Arabic, so they don't speak Farsi, just citing a language barrier. And then Farsi and Arabic are not close at all. I speak Arabic fluently, and I cannot understand Farsi for the life of me. Neither can Yemenis. There are some reports that claim Iran also assists the Houthis with minimal financial and military assistance. And like I said earlier, if you paid attention to where geographically is Iran from Yemen, it's quite a distance away from Yemen. So where they may have supported the Houthis prior to 2015, since 2015, due to the air, sea, and land blockade, it is unlikely that any group is able to bypass the coalition and the US Navy to smuggle artillery into Yemen, because food and water and goods cannot even go into Yemen. The fact of the matter is, Iranians are not in Yemen, nor are Iranian soldiers on the ground helping the Houthis in Yemen. But of course, like I said, Iran is, the US's arch enemy. And also so many other powers have a problem with Iran and have for decades. So, using Iran in addition, in reference to the Houthis is easy clickbait. So what has the impact looked like? Since 2015, over 100,000 Yemenis have been killed by the violence, and over 85,000 Yemeni children have starved to death due to the famine. This is according to Save the Children. Recently, the UN released a report that predicts that the death toll will surpass 230,000 by the end of 2020. Over 18 million Yemenis are food insecure. 90% of Yemenis do not have access to electricity. And, I think these are the many privileges that we have here in the States, and we think about what would happen if we lost our electricity. I know that I, for one, will be on the phone with PG&E and saying, what is going on in my neighborhood? But unfortunately, Yemen does not have that privilege. Over 16 million Yemenis do not have access to healthcare. Over 3 million Yemenis are internally displaced. So because of the blockade and the ban, Yemenis are effectively boxed in. 10 million Yemenis are a step away from famine, and 7 million Yemenis are malnourished. As with all crises, women and children are the most vulnerable. 4.5 million children and pregnant women are acutely malnourished. Over 16 million do not have access to clean drinking water, and this has brought on fatal diseases such as cholera, diphtheria. The worst cholera outbreak ever recorded has infected over 2 million Yemenis, and thousands have died from this preventable disease, which in this modern world should not exist. So these are not just numbers. I remind myself, as I remind everyone else, these are real people with real lives who at one point had dreams and goals like we all do. They wanted a future like we all wanted. And I can't even begin to imagine the trauma that children that were born into this war during an ongoing war environment, what that looks like. I think the trauma or the effects of that have yet to be recorded, and it adds a layer of harm that will likely won't find out about until the coming years. And now that COVID has entered the arena, lack of access to clean water, a crumbled infrastructure, a collapsed healthcare system have led to the closure of curbing this virus is seemingly impossible. Attacks on hospitals and clinics have led to the closure of more than half of Yemen's pre-war facilities. Health experts in Yemen have said that COVID could spread faster and more widely and with deadlier consequences than in many other countries in the world. On top of that, the same day that COVID was announced in Yemen, which is in April, mid-April, two international agencies, USAID and the World Food Program, cut aid into Houthi-controlled areas. And Houthi-controlled areas are over 80% of Yemen. And obviously, 80% of Yemenis are not Houthis. These are your everyday Yemenis that are apolitical and are just trying to live. To date, there have been over 2,000 declared COVID cases and approximately 500 dead. And this is an understatement. It is an underestimated number. Many Yemenis die in their homes, and that is not recorded. I know I'm going over time, forgive me. I'm gonna go through the next slides quickly. I like to stray away from pictures of hungry and dead children. Here are some less horrific pictures that give us an idea of what impact looks like. Picture number one is of school children being taught in a makeshift classroom in a building that's been destroyed by airstrikes. And residue of these bombs say made in the USA. They have labels, and Yemeni people know where the bombs are coming from. This is relevant to a lot of parents now, where we're debating whether or not we want our kids to go back to school. Do we want them to learn virtually, or even having an option of a learning pod? We have challenges, right? But we have options. I can't imagine sending my children to a destroyed building to learn. Image number two is where Yemeni children there are digging graves for their classmates who were killed in August of 2018 when a Saudi-led airstrike bombed their school bus on their way to school. We helped target that school bus. Our New York chapter is actually organizing a protest this Friday to remember that horrific attack because it happened on August 9th, 2018. Number three is a recent one from May of this year, which shows mass graves being dug in Aden due to COVID deaths. And number four is what old Sana'a looks like now. Their core has been hit by airstrikes throughout the years, and now with the floods have caused them to collapse. These are UNESCO heritage sites that are collapsing. This should be an international crisis on its own. Why? Why is this happening? Aside from Saudi Arabia being our allies and the endless loyalty that our administrations have had to feed their interests and the revenue generated from the sale of arms, Yemen is at a strategic location. If you can see there, the area that is circled to the left, could be your right, near Eritrea, called Bab al-Mandeb, near Al-Hudaydah. It is a strip of water that connects two larger bodies of water, where 4.8 million barrels of oil flow through daily. It's the gateway to the Red Sea. And since oil is still essential, economic superpowers want to control these points, not just in Yemen, but also in different parts of the world, like Iran, for example, which has a Strait of Hormuz, where over 20 million barrels pass through. Iran has threatened to close Strait of Hormuz, which would stop oil tanker traffic. It would disrupt a global oil supply and send oil prices shooting up. So securing these two locations would secure the flow of oil. What has been done and what has advocacy look like, and how can people join? I'm going to try to quickly gloss over this. Aside from protesting and raising awareness, we have also been pushing legislation. While the Congress never authorized the US to intervene into the war in Yemen in 2015 in the first place, the most viable mechanism that we have to end US support for these war crimes and to cut arms sales to the coalition and to cut the US military budget is through Congress. One path is by passing the War Powers Resolution, which is the War Powers Act. It's a congressional resolution designed to limit the US's presidential ability to escalate military actions abroad. It was enacted by Nixon in 1973 with the goal of avoiding another lengthy conflict such as the Vietnam War. The US Constitution, which gives us the power to make war, is shared by executive and legislative branches. As commander-in-chief of the military, the president is charged with directing the armed forces, not authorizing the war, right? Congress, meanwhile, is vested with the power to declare war. We've seen time and time again US presidents abusing their powers and overreaching. So the War Powers Resolution has been invoked for Yemen 3 times since 2017 by progressive lawmakers such as Ro Khanna, Pocan, Chris Murphy, Bernie Sanders, Barbara Lee. Last year, we had a huge victory, like Randall shared earlier, when SJR Res 54 passed through both chambers. It was approved by both sides. It was bipartisan. Yet, as promised by Trump, he vetoed it. So if you peruse through our Facebook page and other social media outlets, you'll find us asking folks to call their lawmakers and urge them to vote on one of these bills. War Powers Resolution also included language that would cut arms sales to the coalition. Since we have a legacy of endless wars and war profiteering, it's easy to understand why these measures failed, unfortunately. We have tried in the past to also reduce our military budget because the Pentagon's budget makes up the largest percentage of the overall federal budget of the United States. And unfortunately, since 2019, the last NDAA, which is National Defense Authorization Act, it kind of lets us know where money will be allocated to. Last year, it was $738 billion budget for the Pentagon, which was for this year. What we did last year was urge folks to push their reps to vote no on that bill, but unfortunately, it passed with those measures in place. And this year, the vote just happened a couple of weeks ago. We were calling on the Pentagon to cut the budget by 10%, the Pentagon budget by 10%, which would have made $74 billion available for responding to COVID here and other needs of people who aren't generals, right? But unfortunately, that didn't happen. So in closing, we can see that the situation is complex, right? There are many factions in Yemen. There are also many challenges that I left out for the sake of time, such as like I glossed over the Muslim ban that's still in effect, or how the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, has occupied Socotra Island and run secret prisons, allegedly torturing and sexually assaulting Yemenis, or the fuel tankers, which have been floating off the coast of Yemen, loaded with more than 1 million barrels of crude oil, is at risk of rupturing or exploding, which can create massive environmental damage, and not to mention harm the people of Yemen themselves. So, solving all of them are beyond our control as Americans. So how do we reconcile with seeing all of these horrifying images of starving Yemeni children, bombed school buses, hospitals, weddings, and the destruction of an ancient nation, knowing that our government has a role in the world's worst humanitarian crisis? What we can do as Americans is fight to end US support for the coalition's aerial bombardment on Yemen, and we can fight to cut arms sales to the coalition. And that's what the Yemeni Alliance Committee does, is we help simplify all of this political jargon and we make advocacy, hopefully, I hope I've made it kind of easy, a little bit simpler for the average apolitical American. Here you have an example of a material that we created with some of our partners. And if you're already an organizer, please consider incorporating steps to end this illegal war on Yemen into your existing advocacy efforts. We have a whole bunch of toolkits and materials to get folks engaged and involved. Lastly, while we believe that the solution for the war to end and for Yemen to finally see peace, Yemen is also in need of food and aid. Because like I said, Yemen is experiencing a human catastrophe, and the only organization that we can endorse and recommend is YRRF, which is founded by my dear friend, Dr. Aisha Jehan. She's a sister in this movement. So please give to YRRF if you're in the financial capacity, if you have financial capacity to do so. And lastly, thank you for listening. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and then you can find a lot of this material and kind of how you can be a part of this movement as well. And I will now pass it off to Sarah. Please forgive me for this long-winded talk.
Jehan, thank you so much for your presentation and for that deep dive into the historical roots of the conflict and sharing the beauty of your of Yemen and but also the tragedy as well in the conflict. So thank you very much for that. And indeed, we're going to turn to Sarah Bakir, who's going to take us into some of the health impacts and consequences of the ongoing struggle.
Okay, hi everyone. So I'll be talking about the health impacts, just a quick overview of it, and then I'll focus on specifically attacks on water infrastructure in Yemen due to the war. So here's a quick outline. Like I said, I'll talk an overview of the health impacts, then I'll talk about the attacks on these water facilities and the health impact of these attacks, and then what some NGOs are doing about and the response to these attacks and the health impacts. Okay, so as many people have already said, the UN declared that the Yemen civil war is considered the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. To give you some context, there are around 30 million people living in Yemen right now, and of the 30 million, 24 million need humanitarian assistance, and half of that are children. 2 million children under the age of 5 require treatment for acute malnutrition. More than half of the health facilities have been damaged and destroyed by airstrikes and bombs, and 50,000 healthcare workers are working without pay since 2016. Before the war, there were 32% of Yemeni people without access to healthcare, and that number increased to 54%. And right now, currently, there are more than 10 million children that do not have access to sufficient healthcare in Yemen. Okay, so because of the destruction of health facilities and water facilities, and then like Jehan said, the blockade, which is a really big problem right now, there has been very limited access to vaccines and humanitarian aid. And this has led to an increased risk of serious childhood diseases that I'll talk about, as well as malnutrition. So to give you some context, before the war, 70 to 80% of children were vaccinated, but then after the war, which was, like Jehan said, around 2014, 2015, vaccine coverage for all antigens decreased, including first dose measles, which decreased to 36% in 2016. And diseases like diarrheal disease, like cholera, increased to 12%, and malnutrition increased to 16%. And the first case of COVID-19 was reported on April 10, 2020 in Yemen. And that the number of cases increased to almost 2,000 with almost 500 deaths. Of course, this number is very underreported, like Jehan said, because of limited testing in Yemen. If this continues, if the limited vaccines and limited humanitarian assistance continues, then this would lead to 5 million children not receiving polio vaccinations, almost 2 million not receiving diphtheria vaccinations, and over 2 million not receiving cholera vaccinations. Okay, so a Yemeni journalist named Ahmed Abdel Karim said that the US-backed Saudi-led coalition has repeatedly, systematically, and deliberately attacked water and sewage treatment infrastructure in Yemen since it began its military campaign against the country in 2015. So I'm going to talk about some of the, some examples of these attacks. So in April 2018, a water facility in Sahar was destroyed, and it left 7,500 people without safe drinking water. It also damaged the solar energy system for the water facility. And this water facility was also under attack in 2015. Another example was in July 2018, a water facility in Saada. It came under attack. This was the third attack on the same water facility. It damaged more than half of the facility, including the solar power system, the pump, and the sewage tank. And it cut off over 10,500 people from safe drinking water. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about the health impacts of these attacks on water facilities. So the biggest impact, of course, is on water sanitation and hygiene, also known as WASH. Currently, right now, 18 million Yemenis are in urgent need of WASH assistance. Almost 70% lack access to soap and hand washing and personal hygiene, which is very crucial right now because of COVID-19 and the spread is increasing rapidly. And then over 11 million lack access to basic water they need to survive. Another contribution to the attacks on water facilities is the spread of the cholera cases and the biggest outbreak in record. And the first 11 cases were on October 10, 2016. And that number increased by the end of 2016 to almost 13,000. The peak of the outbreak was on June 2017, and in June 2017, it was over 1 million. And in 2018 and 2019 and 2020, as you can see, the cases did decrease, and that was due to humanitarian assistance and aid. But even though it did decrease, there are still thousands and thousands of Yemenis, especially children, that are getting sick and getting cholera and are dying from it. And overall, I think since 2016, there was 2.4 million people who got cholera. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about nonprofit organizations and their response to these attacks in water facilities and their response to the health impact of these attacks. UNICEF created this cholera prevention and response plan, and they focus on high-risk suspected cholera areas, diarrhea treatment, chlorination of water sources, rehabilitation of wastewater systems, and hygiene awareness. Because of their efforts, they were able to decrease the cases in 2018, and they were able to give access to drinking water to over 5 million people. And then also over 5.5 million people living in high-risk cholera areas had access to household level water treatment and disinfection as well. Another nonprofit organization called MSF, which is the French version of Doctors Without Borders, they created and established 37 cholera treatment centers throughout Yemen, and they were able to admit more than 100,000 patients since 2017. And they also are very strong and supportive of the Yemeni healthcare workers, and they make sure that they financially support them, and they always staff them instead of getting outside people, outside healthcare workers. And because of their efforts, they were able to decrease the amount of admitted patients in their cholera treatment centers. So for instance, they decreased the admitted patients from 11,000 in June 2017, which is, like I said, the peak of the outbreak. And they decreased it to around 567 patients that were admitted in October 2017. Okay, so here are more organizations that give humanitarian assistance and support in Yemen. A lot of them are also local and live in Yemen, like Mona Relief, which is this one right here. And Yemen Hope and Relief is also a local Yemeni NGO. If you go on this website right here, you'll find a list of 105 Yemeni organizations that give humanitarian assistance and aid and advocacy. They also categorize it into different sections. So if you're interested in maybe supporting an organization that focuses on the environment in Yemen, or the health, or the education, you could definitely look into it and see what they're doing and support them and donate. And that's pretty much it. These are my references. Thank you. I think now I'm going to send it over to Bob. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Sarah. And indeed, we're going to transition to Bob.
Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you fine.
Okay. Sorry, I just getting myself. Well, I have, I'm going to, first of all, I just want to really thank both Jehan and Sarah for their great talks on what is such a heartbreaking situation in Yemen. And we can only think about all the other wars that are going on now or have over the last decades. Obviously, Syria, Libya come to mind on parallel levels of destruction and so much suffering of people. So I'm going to go rather quickly through my slides just so we could have involvement of our audience. People know about PSR and our sharing with the Nobel Peace Prize for our work on against nuclear weapons proliferation, and Randall has covered our major issues we deal with. And in this, obviously, we've had a lot of focus this year because of the 75th anniversary of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, with one of our core issues of nuclear weapons and their proliferation, which is certainly germane to the situation in the Middle East. But we're also reminded, even on our focus of nuclear weapons and issues of climate change, how central war is in terms of the destruction of public health and our capacity to deal with either issue. And we joined our international affiliates of the International Physician for the Prevention of Nuclear War 5 years ago in the first international edition of Body Count, of dealing with what were the casualties throughout the region of the wars on terror, which you've seen such vivid evidence of. And as a central organizing concept for all of this, and both speakers have certainly touched on this, what Michael Clare has written about in Blood and Oil, in terms of really our post-war reliance on the fossil fuels, and we need to stop pumping for the sake of our climate, and how this has been a central pillar of our economy here in the United States in terms of the pumping of oil and the sales of arms that fuel all of the incredible destruction in the region, which has been addressed. And in so doing, we, as looking at the Saudis and many other regimes in the area, support dictatorships and greatly repress their people. And this dates back into the post-war period that I'll just be sweeping through in terms of the developing relationship with the Saudis as well as with the Shah of Iran. It's of interest given the concerns about Iranian nuclear proliferation here in terms of it was all okay when the Shah of Iran was in power. And some of these rather iconic pictures introduce our role in the mayhem in the region, this being Donald Rumsfeld famously shaking hands with Saddam Hussein before the initiation of the Iran-Iraq war during the 1980s, where up to 1 million people were killed. The first Gulf War under the first Bush administration also led to calamitous levels of deaths and casualties in Iraq. And in a way similar to what we've seen in Yemen, there were also other issues that went beyond the actual conflict in terms of the destruction of infrastructure, water purification systems, and also sanctions placed on the Iraqi people during this time led to significant numbers of Iraqi children to have died, an estimate of over 500,000. And of course, this took a new crescendo in the wake of 9/11. And though many organizations such as ours were raising voices against going to preemptive war, filling the streets, we still had the initiation of the wars on terror, which, like we've seen, have taken their deadly toll throughout the region. The Watson Institute in Brown University and the University, are my slides visible?
Bob, actually, they're not. So if you just hit shared screen, they'll pop
so
up.
sorry. I thought I was doing it. Patrice just told me they're not. I apologize, folks. Okay. Sorry about that. Can you see this now?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry for that, folks. I was just breezing through, so sorry I missed my nifty pictures. Anyway, what I was just about was just addressing was the overall toll of the wars on terror as of the November 1919 through many of these areas, including Yemen, are up to 800,000 people, with significant numbers of refugees in the area as well. And we certainly have focused on our own administration, but this has been bipartisan support of the militarism and arms sales in the region, indicated by this slide during the time of the Obama administration, and which shows the continuity with Trump, which, although nonetheless this has been greatly increased with the very strong relationship with Mohammed bin Salman, as illustrated by this picture, whereby the United States now dominates the global arms trade. Certainly many other actors in this in terms of the geopolitical contention for oil in the region and elsewhere, but we account for 34% of global arms sales, which has its significant impact, obviously, in Yemen in terms of our support for the Saudis, and with our country, and particularly our military-industrial complex, having significant responsibility for this. And the latest on this is the particular role of Mike Pompeo, our Secretary of State, for facilitating this, and many investigations being blocked into his particular role for shilling for our military-industrial complex. Connected to this, and obviously of central concern to us working against nuclear weapons proliferation, and also talked a bit by Jehan, is Trump's role in sabotaging the US-Iran deal, as well as attacks in conjunction with Israel on the Iranian nuclear program that has led to real suffering of the Iranian people and has actually pushed the Iranian regime into an area where they're now saying that they will increase their nuclear program. This is of concern because of new nuclear power programs that give the capacity for nuclear weapons development in the region, with the United Arab Emirates having put a facility online within the last few days, as well as concerns about a possible Saudi program as well. Our view, as well as that of the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, is we really need a Mid-East weapons of mass destruction free zone, where things like the extant nuclear weapons program of Israel and various chemical and biological weapons programs in the region need to be taken as one major problem for disarmament, in concert with our overall thrust to abolish nuclear weapons. President Eisenhower famously underscored the problems with this type of military spending, underscored by our current situation with COVID, where this is a theft from those who hunger, not fed, those who are cold and not clothed. And the Watson Institute also has underscored the immense amount of money that's been spent for the various wars on terror over the last 20 years, coming to around $6.4 trillion. And that includes the costs of staging the wars, building counter-terror capacity, as well as taking care of significant costs for our veterans who have suffered from various ailments from this warfare. Just one example being those veterans who've been ignored because of their exposure to the 24-hour-a-day burn pits in Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere, illustrated by this. And of course, we're not saying anything about taking care of the people who live in these areas, who will go with no compensation and no health care for these problems. We have significant trade-offs in our own country, where the over $730 billion that we pay for the military in 2019 could provide over 200 million adults with low-income health care, or 308 million children. And in the case of COVID, just half of the money, that's $35 billion that we spend for nuclear weapons, nuclear warheads, and delivery systems, could pay for all of these costs of dealing with COVID. We also don't have the money to deal with our unfolding problems with climate change, also a central issue for PSR. We spend 28 times on traditional military security, all of these military budgets, capacity to wage warfare, as opposed to dealing with climate security. Although Michael Clare also reminds us that the future that's unfolding in the wake of climate change is more widespread civil war, the types of conflict over resources, not enough water, etc., that we're already seeing happening not only in the Middle East, but throughout the world, such in areas in Africa. For this reason, this UN Secretary General has called for a global ceasefire, so we could cease and desist from this type of warfare that robs our resources and doesn't allow us the capacity to deal with the real challenges we face. Jehan mentioned Barbara Lee and Mark Pocan's bill to cut the military budget a measly 10%, yet this bill only got the support of 92 Democratic representatives, one independent, illustrating the immense challenge that we have as we try to get the resources for a Green New Deal, and reflective of the power, as this very complex illustration shows you, of the military industrial media complex. As Martin Luther King said well over 50 years ago, a nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. This underscores our challenge that the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists has illustrated, that we're close to midnight, terminal annihilation of our planet through nuclear weapons or global climate change, and I would add interminable warfare as well. This is why we have really striven to unite all of our main work on nuclear weapons and climate change with the mass movements that we need, as is last September, where we joined our forces and broke down the silos, needing the real broad social movement to make the changes that we need, so that every generation, the young people in particular, can have their chance. So thank you, and I apologize for not being aware that my slides weren't shown. Thank you.
We can't hear you, Randall.
Thanks, Bob. We were just enjoying your melodious voice, I said. And so, but we're glad Patrice pointed out that your slides weren't showing. We're going to move quickly now. In case you haven't been reading the chat, we've just extended the time of this webinar by 15 minutes to accommodate any questions and comments that people might have. So we'd ask that either that you type any questions that you might have in the chat, and then we'll raise that for one of our panelists to address. Are there any questions or comments that any of our participants our audience want to make? And so far, we're not. I'm not seeing any questions. I guess I do want to ask a question while people are thinking. A question to Jehan about what. So we are an organization of physicians and other health professionals, and I want to ask what you would say directly to us in terms of what we could do to make a difference in terms of using our knowledge and expertise. Jehan, are you with us? She may. You're on mute, Jehan, if you hear me. There we go. Do you want me to repeat the question, or were you able to hear it?
Yeah, please. I'm sorry. With technical difficulties on my end, forgive me.
Yes, this is the night of technical difficulties. I was just asking you, so we are an association of physicians and other health professionals, and wonder if you have any direct advice to us in terms of using our expertise to help address this issue, particularly in the US, but perhaps abroad as well.
Thank you so much, Randall, for that question. I think that's something that we, I think a lot of people focus maybe on the donating part and not too much on like what are the actual like tangible things that folks can do. Yeah, I think there are there's a lot of potential for what physicians in the US can do to support either potential research or collaborative initiatives where, for example, there's a med student who reached out to me recently, and I have since connected her to Dr. Aisha at YRRF. And they are working on creating video campaigns for Yemen, where there's awareness about COVID, how to prevent it, and what are the best things to wear that are culturally responsive. And then Aisha from YRRF, her team is translating it. So that's just one example of like how physicians can support. I'm sure there are a multitude of other ways when it comes to like either, remedies, not for COVID, obviously we don't have a vaccine, but there are a plethora of disease that Yemen is facing, like I said, cholera, diphtheria, dengue fever. I think there's a lot of potential, but I don't know off the top of my head, but I think that we can talk about it.
Great. I think we have another question that's probably addressed also to you, Jehan, about what do you think are the most important organizations to support in terms of this issue? And Bob, if you want to add to, that would be great.
I think with respect to humanitarian aid, I think I would put YRRF at the top. There are also Save the Children, Oxfam. With respect to advocacy, there are not that many. There's us, there is FCNL, Friends of the Committee with National Legislation, there is Win Without War. These are all of our partners that work in this kind of anti-war movement. I can also send a lot of these links to folks who are interested.
That would be great, and we'll post them with the other resources on our website. Bob, do you want to highlight just some of the partners that we work with already in terms of this same area, in terms of anti-war groups?
Sure. Beyond the, what Jehan has mentioned, both Patrice Sutton and I are working within the American Public Health Association Peace Caucus in support of efforts of partners who are largely working within the international health section of APHA, who have introduced last year what was a late-breaking resolution to cover most of the issues that have been raised around the public health crisis in Yemen. That did get passed as a late breaker, but as part of the American Public Health Association work, there needed to be a follow-up vote for the resolution. And so we just reviewed their resolution, which just looks superb, and we're going to be looking forward to supporting this at the upcoming meeting that was supposed to be in San Francisco, but it'll be in October, and hopefully the oldest and largest public health association in the world will take a strong effort to support all the things that have been talked about.
Great. Thank you both for that. We've got two more questions, and we'll probably need to begin winding down, so we let people go to their dinner or their rest. The next question really has to do with the map that you showed in your presentation, or maybe it was Bob. Both of you had maps, but showing the oil routes and the importance of Yemen on the one side in terms of the shipping lanes and shipping routes in terms of oil. And the questioner asked, would it be fair to reframe this war as a climate war in terms of the preciousness of oil and the, yep. Do you want to, Jehan, do you want to take a shot at that first, or take a wave at that first, since we're using anti-war language? And then Bob, will go to you.
I definitely agree with Patrice that wars, whether it's war in Yemen, whether it's the endless wars that are occurring all over the globe, Venezuela, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, the wars heavily impact the environment. So any war is definitely a climate issue. I don't think that we need to separate the two. This is definitely a war on our globe.
Thank you. And Bob, were you trying to signal to that as well?
Yeah, I would certainly add to that. I mean, one of the reasons that oil has been sought for control by many of the contending powers is because it lubricates the military structures, the naval fleets, et cetera, to dominate the planet for corporate power. And that's been the case all over the last century. So there's that whole cycle for contention of these resources. And that's one of the reasons that we've been talking to many other organizations. Recently, I presented to another webinar that 350 Bay Area and others, the Sunrise Movement, organized about how do we build for a Green New Deal. And we need the money for this, but for the various things we need in that regard. But, you know, unless we're going to stop this type of warfare, we're going to continue to have these conflicts. One perfect example is the contention that's going on now, the arms race in the Arctic, which is now thawing to our planetary peril, but at the same time is a new area for contention among those that are looking to drill oil in the Arctic. So I think the mutually reinforcing struts of militarism, looking for oil, and dying from the use of these fossil fuels that we fight over are so clear.
Thank you. And we've got one more question to Bob and Jehan as well. Just in terms of, so Mohammed says in the chat that really this war has gotten a fraction of the attention that the war in Syria or other wars have got in terms of the US public in particular. And he's wondering about strategies for focusing more attention and moving the US public and the US government on the side of helping to wind down the war rather than to keep it going. Any thoughts about that, Jehan and Bob, if you have some?
Yeah, we have been doing this work since 2014, even before the intervention, and we only recently, about a year and a half ago or so, got the attention, not that it deserves, of course, but more attention than we've had in the past after the journalist Jamal Khashoggi was brutally murdered by the Saudi regime. And that almost forced the American public to really look into how brutal this monarchy is. And then Yemen kind of was tossed into the mix, but I'm glad. Obviously, it was an unfortunate, very sad, tragic situation, but Yemen did get a lot more media coverage then. And then recently, with a lot of the discontent, valid discontent over police brutality, and a lot of the intersectional work with the Black Lives Matter, Yemen again has gone a little bit more light. There's so much oppression happening in the world, and I understand why. It's kind of a competition. Unfortunately, I don't believe in oppressive Olympics, but it's a lot going on. And I think also with the war in Yemen, the U.S. is actively involved in supporting the coalition, actively involved in arming the coalition, because like I said, without the U.S. support, the coalition will not be able to create such chaos. They just don't have the capacity or the equipment. So I think that those are a lot of the reasons why Yemen hasn't gotten enough attention, but I'm hopeful because here we are today, and we met just a few days ago, right, virtually. And I think there's a lot of hope if we kind of all, shoulder to shoulder, really put Yemen in the front of a lot of these politicians who are voting the wrong way.
Thank you for that. And thank you for the reminder about the kind of happenstantial way that the bill happened in Congress, and you have to take what openings you can, I guess. We need to wind down, but I wanted to ask, so Sarah Bakir, you were kind of the originator of the idea to do this panel, and you nor your family are from Yemen. So I wanted to ask you, maybe if you could just tell us, why did you want to do this panel, and what did you hope that the audience would get from delving into this topic or subject?
I think it goes back to the previous question where, it was considered a forgotten war. And I'm very interested in humanitarian help. And I want to focus on that in my MPH, hopefully. So I was trying to think of like, what country should I pick? And at first I was going to pick Syria because I'm very involved in Syria research and healthcare in general. And then I was going to pick Palestine because I'm Palestinian. But I feel like both those countries get a lot of attention, and Yemen does not. So I felt that a lot of people don't really know what's going on in Yemen. They don't really understand why it's going on. And I feel like Jehan did an amazing job on explaining that. And they don't understand like what the health impacts are as well. So I felt like, awareness and, for people to know what's going on there more, especially physicians that can do something about it.
Thank you for that. And I want to thank you all. Jehan, thank you so much for giving us that overview. And as I said, giving us a sense of the beauty of Yemen, as well as the tragedy. That was very powerful and very important. Sarah Bakir, thank you so much for lifting up the health impacts and for the research that you did on this topic. And some of that research will be posted online for those who are interested. And then Bob, thanks as always for setting what we're doing in the context of PSR's mission and goals. It is incredibly important. And I think we all want to be local and global citizens in terms of tackling injustice and inequities wherever we see them. So thank you all out there for joining us. Thank you to the panelists, and good night to everyone.
Thank you all. Great.
Thank you. Have a good night.
All right.